So we're going to think about this week the portion of Teachigs, which discusses the garments, primarily the garments of the high priest. So if you read it, if you think about last week's parsha and this week's parsha, so last week's parsha we discussed the building of the temple. At that point, it was the portable temple, the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert. And we talked about all the Torah describes and lays out the dimensions of the temple and, every detail about its construction, not just the temple, but also the kelim, the furniture that was discussed last parsha. And this parsha is, okay, who's going to serve in the temple? It's going to be Aaron and his sons, the priests. But for them to serve in the temple, they have to wear garments, beautiful garments. The Torah says the garments are lekavod for honor and letiferet for, but I guess beauty is a translation. Tiferet is, beauty is a fine translation. So they have to wear beautiful garments. Now, just like we talked about the temple, every detail of the temple has spiritual significance. The same is true regarding the garments of the high priests. And what we're going to focus now is a specific garment, the me'il, which is translated as the coat, and more specifically on the bottom of the me'il, on the bottom of the coat, which is more like a tunic, there were bells. The Torah tells us that there were bells, and the Torah tells us that the function of the bells is that Benishma kolo, his voice should be heard when he enters the sanctuary, so that he shall not die. Okay, so what is the implication? First of all, we need noise. You come into Aaron comes to the temple. Think about it as Aaron coming to the temple, and there's noise being produced while he shows up. And somehow or another, that noise is so important that if he doesn't have the sound, then he dies. So it's not just an extra feature, but it's critical to what Aaron's service is. So what we want to figure out is why noise is important. We would think we have verses in the Torah that say, Lo b'rash Hashem in the Bible. God doesn't come with noise. God comes with silence, right? So what is the meaning of the noise that has to be produced from the spiritual perspective? And an interesting twist to that is that when you think about however you're going to explain the function of the noise and why it's so critical, you'll also have to explain how come on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, Aaron's garments were different. He didn't wear the 8 garments, he wore 4 garments. Those 4 garments had no bells. So all of a sudden, what was so critical was the noise. During the first year, all the year, the noise was critical and important. On Yom Kippur, there's no noise. So is noise good? Is noise good? If it's good all year, why is it not good on Yom Kippur? What does noise represent? And that's what we're going to go into the discussion. We'll see how much we can do. That's a discussion that we're going to get into. What's interesting is, I'll give you the tree, I'll give you the end, that this all ties in, of course, to what the Rebbe was talking about at the time when the Rebbe taught this teaching. With the Rebbe, everything is connected to the Torah. So whatever the current events was, automatically he found that in the Torah and in the Rashi and in everything else. So at that period was the time, a few months before, when Chabad started employing what they call mitzvah tanks, where they would take a vehicle and put up Jewish signs and put on the music and go throughout New York City and make noise and invite people to come put on tefillin and take Shabbos candles. And there was some pushback. People were saying, what? You don't take religion or Judaism, and we never heard this, that you're supposed to make noise and make announcements and play music. This is totally foreign. So in that context, at the end of the talk, the Rebbe also addresses why we're doing that. So it's hard to separate the current events from the Torah, because the Torah is really our guide to current events. So you get also here, it's not only an abstract interpretation, even a relevant one to our soul, but it's also an insight into the Rebbe's perspective of how we're supposed to live as Jews in the modern world. So the journey begins. We're going to share the screen, and we're going to get into this debate between Maimonides and between Rashi and Nachmanides about the bells. And it's going to seem technical in the beginning, but eventually we'll get back to it. I'm going to try to go quick. I'm going to try to skip around the technical part in the beginning, because we want to get to the exciting part. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen with God's help. Okay, here we go. No, it's got to be bigger than that. Why is it so small? We'll try again. We got to do better than that. Okay, one last shot. For some reason, when I try to make it bigger, it gets smaller. I'm not going to try to make anything bigger. I'm just going to behave. Okay, here we go. I think everybody can see. Okay, we start here. Okay, I don't know why it's not clear. You know what? Let's try it somewhere else. Let's try on Chabad.org. I'm going to try it somewhere else. Give me just 1 second. Okay, we're going to go here. Let's see the best we can do. Okay, so we're jumping right in on the edge of the Kohen Gadol's robe, the robe of the high priest. Here we go. The Torah describes the robe worn by the Kohen Gadol, stating, "You shall make pomegranates of techelet." Techelet is blue wool on its hem, all around the hem, with bells of gold between them all around. So, in other words, at the bottom, at the hem, at the bottom of the robe, you have pomegranates and bells. Okay. Rashi explains that although the pomegranates are round and hollow, the intent of the phrase bells of gold between them, bitocham, is to clarify that the bells were not located within the hollow space of the pomegranates, but rather between them all around. I can't see what I'm doing. Okay. I'll have to do it again. Sorry, apologize. Okay, rather between them all around. Between every 2 pomegranates, 1 bell was attached and suspended at the bottom of the robe's hem. In other words, you can read the verse as follows. You can read the verse and say that there's a bell within the pomegranate. Right? What is a bell? A bell is just a piece of metal that makes noise by hitting something. So what is it hitting? So you can have the bell, I guess there must be a word for that thing that moves within the bell, and that's within the pomegranate, and that makes noise. Rashi says no. There's pomegranates, and separate from the pomegranates are bells. So you have 1 pomegranate, 1 bell, instead of the bell within the pomegranates. That's Rashi's interpretation. Nachmanides, Ramban doesn't like that. Ramban queries, according to Rashi, the pomegranates serve no functional purpose. If their purpose was purely decorative, why were they made like hollow pomegranates? Let them be made like golden apples. Right? Nachmanides says no. Nachmanides says, I believe that the bell was within the pomegranate. Now he understands why the pomegranate is there. It's part of the bell. Now, if Nachmanides tells Rashi, if you think the pomegranates are just for beauty, then why have beautiful pomegranates? Make a beautiful apple. So 1 second. So there's a commentary on Rashi. Rabbi Leo Mizrahi comments on Ramban's words. I do not know why he chose apples over pomegranates. Like who says apples are more beautiful? Hey, pomegranates are more beautiful. Ramban, Nachmanides takes it as a premise that if it's for beauty, do apples, not pomegranates. So it must be that the pomegranates is part of the bells. Rashi says, no, the pomegranates are separate. They're for beauty. Ramban says beauty. If it's beauty, look for apples. The Ram, commentary on Rashi, says, who said apples are more beautiful than pomegranates? Okay, so we already have a debate. We already have a debate. What's more beautiful, an apple or a pomegranate? Okay, so the simple answer is maybe Nachmanides is talking about, maybe what Nachmanides is saying, because on the menorah we see that apples were for beauty, because there were tapuchim, there was like they were round. Rashi says it says that there were goblets and globes and its flowers, with globes shaped like apples. Rashi says that the globes were shaped like apples. So maybe we see that apples are beautiful in the temple. So if it's for beauty, why are you looking? If it's beauty, Rashi says, so Nachmanides says, if it's for beauty, just you make an apple, not a pomegranate. But that only shifts the question. Who told us why at the menorah, why are apples more beautiful than pomegranates? Okay, that's the introduction. Now we want to jump in to the real question. The real question, as we mentioned, the real question is, what is the function of the noise, and why is noise necessary? And we say if the high priest goes into the temple without the noise, he will die. Why is it necessary? So there are various interpretations. One interpretation is that the noise is like you're knocking on the door. You can't just burst into the king's palace, right? So you knock on the door, you make some noise and say, I'm coming. That's a sign of respect. That's one interpretation. But we'll see there are other interpretations, and we're going to get to the spiritual interpretation as well. But again, we have to keep in mind, if the noise is so important, then how come we don't have it on Yom Kippur? And again, if you're knocking on the door, certainly if you go into the inner chamber of the king, which is what the high priest did on Yom Kippur, certainly you should have to knock. So this is the essential question that we're getting to. So we're looking at section 3. With regard to the purpose of the bells on the robe, the verse states, its sound shall be heard when he enters the holy chamber. This was a significant element of the Kohen Gadol service. Indeed, so significant that the sound will protect him from death, as indicated by the conclusion of the verse, so that he not die. And as Rashi mentions here, from the negative, one can deduce the positive. Like the Torah doesn't say, if you don't have noise, you'll die. The Torah just says, have noise, so that he will not die. And because it says so that he will not die, if he doesn't have the noise, he will die. Clarification is required. Why is the jingling of the bells a prerequisite for entering the holy chamber? Seemingly, the opposite would be called for. Quiet is intimately bound with holiness, as indicated by the verse, God was not in thunder, but in the still, hushed voice. Indeed, with regard to the Kohen Gadol himself, the high priest himself, when he entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, he would not wear the golden vestments, including the robe. Thus, his entry was not accompanied by the sound of the bells, right? Bells, here, everyone should know I'm here, I'm coming, right? That sounds very egotistical, right? Some people, when they enter the room, all of a sudden, everyone has to know that they entered, right? They were making a commotion. So that's what it is. High priest coming before God is coming to the temple. There should be some humility. Why the noise? That's the question that we offer right here. So let's look at the other commentaries. So let's see what Nachmanides says. Nachmanides explains that the jingling of the bells was necessary because one who suddenly enters the king's palace is liable to incur the death penalty. In other words, you can't just show up suddenly to the king's palace. You have to come with respect. And knocking on the door is the form of indicating, asking permission. And the bells is like knocking on the door. The sound of the bells is comparable to requesting permission to enter and perform service. Now, if so, according to Nachmanides, how come on Yom Kippur the king doesn't have to ask permission? The priest doesn't have to ask permission to enter? The answer is because on Yom Kippur, God wants to show the importance of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people don't have to ask permission. They're very intimately connected with God. So on Yom Kippur they can come in without asking. That's what we're going to have in the next paragraph. Based on that reason, one would think that all the more so the Kohen Gadol would need to request permission to enter the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Nevertheless, this was not necessary because on Yom Kippur, God demonstrates the unique distinction of the Jewish people that they do not require an agent. Accordingly, on that day, the Kohen Gadol does not need the bells to jingle and make known his entry. like a person who sends an agent to announce his coming. In other words, Nachmanides says like this. Nachmanides says that when the high priest comes to the temple, it's like he sends a messenger before him asking permission to enter. That's the noise. The noise goes out before he shows up. You already hear the noise. So before you come into someone's home, you have to send a messenger to ask for permission. And Nachmanides says that's the function of the noise. So on Yom Kippur, how come the high priest doesn't have to ask a messenger asking for permission? Because on Yom Kippur, we want to express the great quality of the Jewish people that they can show up to the king without asking for permission. Like a young child coming home. Okay, fine. That's a beautiful interpretation from Nachmanides, all good. The problem is that according to Nachmanides, what comes out is that the noise is not part of the service. The noise is just preparation. In order for the high priest to enter the service, he has to make noise to ask for permission. But the noise represents the asking for permission, the preparation. But it doesn't represent the actual service. We're going to try to say that because every detail within the vestments within the garments of the high priest are precise, that the noise is also part of the service, not just preparation. So we're not knocking Nachmanides' interpretation. It's a fine interpretation. But that explains only the noise as a preparation for the service. And we're going to take it a step further and explain that the noise is actually part of the service. So let's see how we do that. But first, we'll make that point. The problem is, according to that interpretation, it would appear that its sound shall be heard is not part of the Kohen Gadol service, but merely a preface and preparatory step for it. It's only preparation. Nevertheless, there must be another motivating rationale for the inclusion of the bells on the robe. Every element of the Kohen Gadol's service, particularly one for which he is liable for death, involves precise details. The fact that the bells would also make their sound during the Kohen Gadol's service indicates that their sound was germane to the performance of the service itself. Beautiful, beautiful argument, right? It's not that the high priest would show up, would make the noise only when he's entering and then hang up the bells. No, the entire time when he was in the temple performing the service, he's constantly generating noise because the bells are constantly jingling. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the noise is not just preparation for the service, but the noise is critical for the service. And now we want to understand, what does noise represent? And here is the big idea. And once we give the big idea, we'll get to Yom Kippur and why it doesn't happen on Yom Kippur. And we'll get to, of course, like we said, the noise that we make when we go out on the mitzvah things. So what's the big idea? What does noise represent? So the Rebbe is going to say like this, based on other sources in Chassidus about other things, other places. If you look, for example, in the daily service describes various and the blessings before the Shema. The first blessing before the Shema describes the songs of the angels. And there's different types of angels because there are different spiritual worlds. There's Ofanim, there's Chayot HaKodesh, there's all kinds of exciting things going on. Next time you pray and you say that blessings before the Shema, the first blessing before the Shema, you look out, there's a lot going on there. Now, various angels say various things. But when it comes to one group of angels, Ofanim, the Torah says, the prayer says, but quoting the verses in the prophets, says that the Ofanim, those group of angels, they call out Bira'ash Gadol, with a great noise. Whereas other angels just sing the praises of God without great noise. So what does noise represent? So the Kabbalah says like this: noise represents when a person is distant. And when a person is distant and yearns to come close, they have a much greater passion and they scream and shout like they're running away from something negative. We're running away from a fire. You're running away from a fire. Nobody's just sitting calm and collected, right? You're running away from something negative. There's a passion, there's a shout, there's an urgency, there's noise. So somebody who's close to God, when they serve God, there's no excitement. I'm close, there's no problem. But someone who senses that they're distant from God, so when they're realize that they're far from God and they want to come close, it's not calm and collected, it's with passion and with noise. What does that do with the high priest? The high priest, isn't the high priest holy and he's close to God all the time and he's not running away from negativity? Say no. This is a critical point. The high priest is not coming into the temple on his own behalf. The high priest is representing all the Jewish people, including the people, I guess most of the people, who are distant and have to run away from the negativity. And therefore, if he comes in without making noise, meaning without representing the people that feel distant from God, and therefore when they come close to God, it's with the passion and with noise, then he's not doing his job. If he's not doing his job, he's liable to death. Now we understand why on Yom Kippur there's no noise. Because on Yom Kippur, every Jew is close to God. The part of the Jew that's close to God is revealed and expressed. So nobody is distant from God. So if you're not distant from God, there's no noise. So now we understand why the high priest has to make noise while he's doing the service. And if he doesn't have the noise, he's missing a critical component and he's liable of death because he's dropping the ball. He's not doing his mission. What is his mission? His mission is to represent the people who are distant. And therefore, because they're distant, they actually have an advantage. We'll talk about that later. The next phase is the advantage that comes with the passion. Okay, so let's read it inside because the Rebbe is going to say it much better than I can say it. So here we go. Okay, I'm going to share that link because sometimes Elisa likes to have the link. So
thank you.
Let's see if I can do that. Chat. There you go. Paste. Okay. To elaborate upon one of the explanations for the jingling of the bells, I'm reading number 4. The Kohen Gadol performed his service as an agent for the Jewish people as a whole. In other words, he's not coming in for himself. It's not that he's a privileged class and he can come in whenever he wants. No, when he enters the temple and he's serving God as an agent of the collective Jewish people. This implies that when he would enter the holy chamber, he would take with him the entire Jewish people. As explained at length at several sources, the divine service of Baalei Teshuvah, penitents, who are motivated by their distance from God and seek to flee from evil, is carried out with a clamor. It is like one who bolts away from a life-threatening situation with shouts and an uproar. So in other words, you have the tzaddik, the righteous person, you have the Baal Teshuvah, someone who's returning from negativity. The person returning from negativity, he does so with much more passion and noise and an uproar. Now we're going to say, this applies within every person. So even a righteous person can cultivate the noise. Why? Because even a righteous person who never sinned is also a Baal Teshuvah, also has to come close to God. Why? Because when the soul comes into this world, the soul becomes an own independent existence and feels separate from God. So even the godly soul feels like it's its own independent existence. So therefore, the godly soul wants to escape its own existence, its own ego, even though it's a holy ego, but it's an ego. When it feels that it's distant and it feels that it has an independent consciousness, it wants to escape that. And if it escapes it, you don't escape from a danger calm, cool, and collected. You escape from danger with noise. Parallels to such divine service of the Baal Teshuvah exists for every Jew, even one who has not sinned. When he contemplates his spiritual state, he realizes that he is distant from God because, first of all, there's 2 reasons why I'm distant from God. First of all, my animal soul. But then we're going to say, even my godly soul, when it's down here in this earth, is distant. The animal soul still exists within him. Within him. This is a mistake. With its initial strength, his ego, his wants and desires motivate his thoughts. He is a yesh, a self-concerned entity separated from godliness. Alternatively, his self-awareness may stem from the good within him, his godly soul, a holy entity, but one that is conscious of its own existence and is not characterized by bittul, self-nullification. In other words, if I have the awareness of the animal soul, I'm certainly distant from God. Even if I have the awareness of the godly soul, I'm distant from God. Why? Because in this world, the godly soul also feels like it's its own independent existence. So I'm not completely self-nullified. So if I feel myself, I don't feel God. So if I feel myself, I'm distant. So if I want to come close to God, I sense that I'm distant. And if I'm distant, means I'm in a negative space. And if I'm negative space, I want to escape the negative space and come close to God. The awareness that his selfhood distances from God arouses him, and he seeks to flee from that state with a loud clamor. That is a beautiful story. We have to get a little story. In that vein, it is related that when the Baal Shem Tov was asked, why Hasidim make animated motions in the middle of prayer? When the Hasidim would pray, they would swing their hands and make noises and move their body. So it was unheard of. It was an unheard of custom. It was unheard of practice. So they asked the Baal Shem Tov, why are they doing that? He answered with an analogy. To a person drowning at sea, he will make all sorts of wild gestures to save himself and shout with all his strength for others to save him. Certainly no one will be seeing his gestures or hearing his shouts will find them humorous. So in other words, why are you jumping around and screaming? Because you feel that you're drowning. Where am I drowning? I'm drowning in my own sense of self. I feel distant from God. So in that sense, when the high priest is coming close to God and enters the temple, he's entering the temple not only on his behalf, but on behalf of all Jews who feel distant from God. Who feels distant from God? Certainly the people who sin, but not only. Even someone who never sinned, if they really think about the fact that their consciousness, the fact that they feel themselves, puts them in a place that they're distant from God. So now when they want to come close to God, they're escaping their own painful existence separate from God. And therefore they feel like they're running away from danger, and therefore they do so with a passion. And that's the noise that is produced from the bells of the high priest. And now we have to understand why Yom Kippur we don't have it. And we'll get to the next step and say, actually, the noise is not just for the people who are we'll say that it's not just because we're distant, but there's actually a benefit to being distant to that type of service. So let's get to Yom Kippur. That's the next thing we have to address. The clamor of such divine service is not at all a contradiction to the virtue of stillness implied by the verse, God was not in thunder. The name of God used in that verse is Yud Kei Vav Kei Havaya, the name associated with godliness that is utterly unlimited, transcending the worlds. To be a conduit for that level of godliness, one's divine service must reflect a still and hushed voice, i.e. carried out with consummate bitul. By contrast, divine service that is still associated with feeling yeshus, feeling the self, concern for oneself and one's own being, relates to the level associated with godliness, with the God's name Elohim, the name associated with the dimension of godliness that allows for existence, that feels separate from godliness. Such divine service involves clamor, as explained above. I don't want to get into this too much. Let's get to Yom Kippur. This is the reason why the service of the Kohen Gadol throughout the year involved its sound being heard. He had to take the entire Jewish people with him into the holy chamber, including also those Jews whose entry to divine service, the realm of holiness, is characterized by loud clamor. The position of the bells on the hem, i.e. the lower edge of the robe, and the jingling of the bells alludes to the inclusion of Jews on the lowest levels whose divine service involves approaching God from afar with the clamor as explained above. So now we add another detail. Where were the bells? The bells were at the bottom of the robe. The bottom represents even the Jews who were distant, not even, the Jews who are sense the distance, at the bottom of the robe are producing the noise. For this, the Kohen Gadol was warned, his sound shall be heard so that he not die. His life as a whole was dependent on this sound being heard. If that was lacking, i.e., if he was not willing to include in his divine service those Jews found on the hem of the robe, even if the reason for not doing so was because he saw the loftier divine service associated with his still and hushed voice, his existence and his divine service would be nullified. The reason is that the consummate fulfillment of the Jewish people as a whole depends on divine service that includes all 600,000 Jews, from the heads of your tribes to your wood choppers and water drawers. In other words, if the high priest is not representing everybody, he undermines his own existence and is worthy of death. Okay, so this is all explaining why there's noise the whole year. Now we move to the next step. If so, what about on Yom Kippur? So I'm going to skip a little bit to get to the points. By contrast, the service of the Kohen Gadol in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur was carried out without noise. On that day, the Jews were like angels who serve God in silence. Moreover, the essential bond of all Jews shared with God is revealed. Then all Jews, even those on the hem of the robe, are in a state of intimate closeness and oneness with God. One people affirming God's oneness. Accordingly, their entrance into the Holy of Holies via the Kohen Gadol does not resemble the approach of one who is distant and trying to draw close, that is accompanied by noise, but rather it characterized by consummate bittul, a still and hushed voice. In other words, on Yom Kippur, we're not distant trying to come close. On Yom Kippur, the core of the Jew, which is always close to God, is revealed and expressed, and therefore there is no need for noise. Okay, we still have things to take care of. We have to talk about the pomegranates and the apples. We have to talk about, we still have some business to take care of. But if anybody has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we continue. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a question about the nature of the noise, if anybody talks about it, because it's not just regular noise. The bells are considered to be like kind of music.
Yes. Yeah, it's musical, but the way the Torah characterizes it, I guess there are different interpretations. So music is one form, but I guess you could. Okay, I'm jumping in. Let's do 2 steps. Let's start step 1, then step 2, because you're more mystical than I, so it takes me time to catch up to you. Step number 1 is when the Torah characterizes the noise, the Torah doesn't characterize it as music. The Torah says, "V'nishma kolo," his sound will be heard. So that's step number 1. Step number 1 is so of course you can characterize the music in all sorts of ways, but the Torah sorry, I can't. I lost my
We could still see you.
better light.
We could still see you and hear you.
Okay, I can't see you, so I'm going to go to this. So strange. Give me just 1 second. I'll try to straighten things out here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what am I saying? I'm saying 2 steps. First of all, when the Torah characterizes this, the Torah characterizes this noise, the Torah characterizes it as noise. So it's not music. And that's why the Rebbe is saying that what's clear here is we're talking about noise of somebody escaping, because that's what the Torah says, noise, not music. I think you're getting to a second step. Later, we're going to get to maybe for God, this is music. In other words, what God really appreciates is the noise, and the noise, which sounds to us as just chatter, becomes music. In other words, for God, which one is more beautiful? The service of the person running away or the service of the person who's close? So we're going to get to that. The next step is the superiority of the noise. So I think characterizing as music is step number 2. Step number 1 is the escape. And that's why the Torah says, "V'nishma kolo," his sound. It's not about music. It's about this cry. It's about the noise, the sense that I'm distant and I want to come close to God. That's the longing. And then Vicky is saying, "Oh, that's also that becomes music." I think that's step 2. I just want to say right here, it's not in this talk. Go ahead.
Also, the shape of pomegranate reminds the shape of the bell more than the apple. That's
okay.
A discussion.
Yeah, so that's part of the discussion. Nachmanides says the pomegranate is part of the bell.
The bell that they use that sounds better. The more pomegranate, like more than apple.
Right. So we'll get to that in a second, what that means. I don't know if you have to read it inside, but the apple represents the service of the righteous. The pomegranate represents the service of the people. The Talmud says that the pomegranate, the pomegranate is a metaphor for even the person who's distant from God, even the Jew who's distant from God is full of mitzvot like the pomegranate. Like the pomegranate has seeds. So in general, in Talmudic literature, the pomegranate represents somebody who is distant, but still, nevertheless, everybody is full of at least okay. Look at you look at Hasidic literature, you ask which one is it's the silent prayer. Why the silent prayer? Because we're close to God. If we're close to God, there's no need for noise. So what we see here, that within the everyday service, we also have these two notions of the noise and the non-noise, the all year and Yom Kippur. When you're distant, you create noise. That's when you say the Shema. You're not one with God. You're trying to cultivate the love, and the love is cultivated by passion. But passion represents the self, and that's noise. But then you also have the Amida. You come before God, there is silence, because when you come before God, then there's no room for noise, because noise represents, I feel myself distant, I want to come close. Silence is, I'm one with God. So you have both elements. Now the question is, which one is greater? Not greater, they're different, but let's get to the next step and talk about the actual advantage of the noise. But for that, I have to reopen the screen. Okay. Now we get to the question of which one is greater. Although, from a straightforward and surface perspective, divine service that involves its sound being heard reflects a lower level than divine service that expresses a still hushed voice. In other words, what are we saying? The silence means you're close to God. That's like Yom Kippur. The noise represents you're distant and you're escaping the negativity, you're escaping the sense of self to come close to God. And that's why you're screaming, you're shouting like the guy drowning. So on the surface, it seems that the silence is a higher level. Divine service that expresses a still hushed voice is nevertheless, in other words, even though I'm at the surface, reflects lower than divine service. Okay, where am I in this paragraph? I'll start again. Although from a straightforward and surface perspective, divine service that involves its sound being heard reflects a lower level than divine service that expresses a still hushed voice. Divine service that produces noise possesses, divine service that possesses an advantage. Divine service that produces noise possesses an advantage over the divine service characterized by bittul. Silence means I don't feel myself. I feel close to God. I don't feel myself. I'm not in a distant place. Noise represents I feel myself and I want to escape the self. But I feel myself and I'm still close to the negativity and I'm escaping the negativity. Nevertheless, there's an advantage in the noise. Why? Divine service that expresses a still hushed voice is limited in nature. True, the person serving God is characterized by bittul, but his service is settled in nature, like light enclosed in a kli, a medium. It is defined and structured. By contrast, divine service that involves its sound being heard reflects an unbounded quality. The loud noise made indicates that the person is going beyond the limits of his kelim, personal capacities. He cannot confine his excitement and therefore expresses it by shouting vocally. This reflects one of the reasons why in a place where Baalei Teshuvah stand, perfectly righteous men are incapable of standing. The clamor that accompanies the service of Teshuvah expresses the unlimited nature of the soul. This is so profound. A person may be righteous. He's righteous. He's not screaming. He's not distant. But if he's calm, then the way he's serving God is limited. When a person senses that they're distant and they're excited, why are they shouting? Why are they excited? Because they don't want to be contained. They don't want that feeling to be limited and contained. That feeling is sort of bursting out of them. that bursting represents they're going beyond themselves. And because they go beyond themselves, they reach a higher level within godliness. So what we started out as the bells being at the bottom of the robe, now we're saying there's actually an advantage on the noise being produced from the bottom, from the person who senses that they're distant, because if you're excited, it means that you cannot contain the light. And the righteous person, everything is fine. He's not shouting. He comes to shul, he davens, he goes to study Torah, he goes to do his business, but it's all calm and cool and collected. Why? Because he's not distant. Okay, but if he's not distant, the service of God is limited. The person who's excited and screaming and shouting, it doesn't mean screaming with a voice, but it means he's passionate. He senses at the distance and he'll do everything he can to move closer. He goes beyond his own limitation, and that's why he touches the infinity of God. And that's why the Talmud says, one of the reasons why the Talmud says that the person who sinned and is becoming close is much greater than the person who is completely righteous, because they serve God beyond their limitation. So that's the story about the high priest. Like I said, with the Rebbe, all current events was part of Torah. And at that point, in 1975, Tashan Lamed Hey, we just started with the Chabad mitzvah tanks, which was about making noise. And so the Rebbe says, okay, what's the lesson for our generation? Here we go. So here you have a history lesson as well. The above provides a unique directive for our generation, the generation of Ikvata de Mashiach, the era when Mashiach's approaching footsteps can be heard. The Talmud refers to the era of the generation before the coming of Mashiach as the footsteps of Mashiach. True, it is universally accepted that because of the low spiritual level that prevails in our time, it is necessary to take an active part in the spreading of the Torah and the strengthening of Yiddishkeit. A person cannot be content remaining in his own place, even if it is a place of Torah, and wait until someone approaches him and asks him to spread his Torah knowledge. Instead, it is necessary for him to go out to the street, to chutza. Chutza means to the outside, the outer border, to find estranged Jews and transform them into Balei Teshuvah, people who repent. However, one might ask, so it's true, yes, so we're in a difficult situation, there's spiritual darkness, so you can't wait for someone to come to you and say, please teach me Torah. You have to go to the street, you have to go to them, and you have to bring them close to Judaism. That's granted. However, one might ask, why is it necessary to go out to the street with a loud outcry that Jews should put on tefillin, affix mezuzahs on their doors, give tzedakah, or the like? A tumult about such matters was never made in previous generations, right? There was never a situation where you go into the street and you play music and you ask people to come and put on tefillin or affix a mezuzah. This is totally unheard of. The answer to the above, according to all the signs mentioned in the Talmud at the end of Tractate Sota, we are presently in the era of Ikvasa de Mashiach, on the lowest levels, the hem of the robe. We must know that there must be bells on the hem of the robe for the Jews represented by these bells to come under the wings of the divine presence. It is necessary for its sound to be heard. It is specifically the noise produced by the service of Teshuvah that reflects the zinth of divine service as explained above. So this is beautiful. The Rebbe is saying that the bells at the end of the bottom of the robe represents the bottom of history, the end of history. Our generation is when the noise has to be heard. And we go the next step. That's one step. The next step is, and that's one step in the journey. The first step is that because we're the end of the history, the end of the exile, the noise is for our generation to encourage people to come back to God with noise. And then the Rebbe says, if you also look out on the culture and you see the culture we're in, you have to battle the negative aspects of the culture by its own medicine. And in this culture, there's always advertising, right? The negativity advertises itself. It's not silent. The negativity is loud. And because the negativity is loud, you have to battle that with that same feature. And the holiness also has to come out with a loud voice to counter the voice of the negativity. And here we go. There is another element relevant to the above points. At present, to borrow our sage's wording, among those who violate God's will, the sound of the multitudes of Rome can be heard. This is a reference to, I think it was the first Sikha we learned here on Wednesdays. This is a reference to the Talmudic story that there were 5 rabbis who, remember the story, everyone cried, they cried and Rabbi Akiva laughed. So there were 2 stories, right? It's the end of Tractate Tainit. The 2 stories. The second story is that they went to the Temple Mountain and they saw a fox coming out from the place of the Holy of Holies. And all the rabbis cried and Rabbi Akiva laughed. That was the second story. The first story is they were going to Rome and they heard from miles away, they heard the Kol Hamona Shel Romi. They heard the noise of the city of Rome. So the sound of the multitudes of Rome. And when that happened, everybody cried and Rabbi Akiva laughed. So Rabbi Akiva said, why are you crying? So they said, these people are living in peace and they have noise and there's excitement. And the home of God is destroyed. So Rabbi Akiva said, if this is what happens to those who go against God's will, how much more so those who perform God's will have this in the future. So we're playing on those words. So the Rebbe says, those who violate God's will, the sound of the multitudes of Rome can be heard. In other words, in the negative sense, in the negative culture, there's noise. Nobody is silent. The advertising business is a multi-billion-dollar business. All matters opposing holiness are not conducted in privacy, but rather with the most vocal publicity and are loudly broadcast. The way to nullify the clamor raised by the forces of unholiness is to adopt a similar and comparable mode of conduct, because from the forest itself, it has taken the handle of the axe with which to fell it. So this is footnote 65, I believe it's from the Zohar. Now Tanya citing wording from Sanhedrin, the Talmud. So this is a beautiful metaphor. The Talmud says if you have a forest and you want to chop the forest, what do? You take an axe. But what is the axe made of? So the axe has a piece of metal. But to hold the metal, you have wood. So the irony is that the wood from the forest, you take the wood to chop down the forest. And what that means is that Tanya uses it, if you want to battle the negativity, you have to use the methods of negativity to battle the negativity, because you have to undermine it by its own power. And because the negativity is shouting and publicizing itself, then if we want to battle that, we have to use that same quality and broadcast the positive holiness. When those who follow God's will carry out the divine service in a manner that its sound will be heard. That's the quote from this parsha. V'nishma kola, when the high priest comes, his sound will be heard. So those who fulfill God's will, when they perform their service, they also do so with sound, with noise, and do so in the same place as the sound of the multitudes of Rome. That's where the mitzvah tank goes. It goes to this place, the center of the culture of Rome, which is Western culture. The negative effects of the clamor of unholiness will be nullified. Moreover, if for those who violate his will it is so, and they dwell in prosperity, all the more so, will this be true for those who follow his will? The Jews will dwell in security and tranquility in their land, for the great shofar will be sounded. It's a play, great shofar, also noise, right? The great shofar will be heard with the sound of the herald who will announce and proclaim. Again, we're quoting all the verses that represents the kol, the voice, the advent of the redemption may come in the immediate future. This is a talk that the Rebbe delivered on Shabbos Tetzaveh, this week's parsha, Tavshin Lamed Hey, 1975. This was short. This is the synopsis of the edited talk. So this was lots of fun. Again, to summarize, we begin with the perspective of why does the high priest need noise? Because the noise represents the Jews who are distant. And if you're distant and you're in a negative place and you realize that you're so far from God, when you come close to God, you're not walking calmly, but you're coming with a tremendous passion and noise. And that's why at the bottom of the robe, you have the bells that produce noise, because we're talking about the Jews who are on the lower level. Yom Kippur, we're all on a high level, we're all close to God, because the essence of the soul that is close to God is felt, and therefore there's no noise necessary. That was step number 1 of the talk. Step number 2 is we say 1 second. There's actually an advantage in the noise. There's an advantage in a person who's distant, even over the person who is close. And why is that? Because the person who is close, he's serving God, but he's serving God without passion, without noise, without going beyond his own capabilities. So everything is limited. And if you're serving God with your limitation, you're only touching the limited aspects of God. But if you are escaping, you're going beyond yourself. That's what you're shouting. Shouting means I can't contain my excitement. Then I'm going beyond myself. If I go beyond myself, I'm touching the infinite. I'm going beyond the limitation of self. So I get the essence of God, which is not limited. That's what Kabbalah explains. That the moment I break out of my limitation, so it's sort of my infinity, it's not truly infinite because going beyond my limitation, for me, it's past limitation. But for you, that's still considered limitation. So in other words, when I go beyond myself, my custom is to learn for 5 minutes a day, and I learn 6 minutes a day, breaking my limitation. It's not infinite, it's only 6 minutes. But because it's my infinity, therefore I touch the essence of infinity. And that you don't get without the passion, and that you don't get without the noise. And that's why, that's the advantage of the passion. So it's not just that, oh, there's a few Jews who cannot, because they can't be silent, they have to make noise, and we have to include them as well. That's the first half. The second point, we go, no, there's an advantage to the noise. And that's the second step. And then we tie it into our generation. Our generation is the end of the exile. We're at the bottom of the robe. We're at the bottom of the robe. In our generation, we have to produce that noise and get everybody who is not distant, at least externally, to come close. And doing so is also the way we battle the culture, which the culture is anything negative is not done in private, it's done out in the open. So we want to battle that by putting the holiness out in the open up front. In the same place of the noise of the multitudes of Rome, we produce the noise of the holiness. So that's the 3 steps of this talk. And I think it's beautiful because it's a nice interpretation. It's relevant to our service of God. And like I said, you played in the Shema and the Amidah. Shema, we're still distant, we're making noise. The Amidah, we're silent, we're close to God. Which is higher? That's why we're not sure which is higher. Because on one level, being silent, you're close. There's an advantage to being silent. You're close to God. You're bittul. You don't feel the self. On the other hand, when I feel myself and I feel distance and I'm screaming and I have passion, I'm going beyond myself. Going beyond myself represents the infinity. So there's an advantage to both. That's the reality. So in our daily service, we also have both elements. But in any case, certainly it gives us an insight into the Rebbe's approach to outreach in this generation, that the noise is not just because we have to draw attention. One of the early Chabad shluchim on campus, his name was Rabbi Nassim Garari, and he went to Buffalo, and he basically, in the 60s, people were so crazy that he looked normal in that, he's a Chabad rabbi, he fit, he looked civilized compared to what everybody else was doing. And where all the, people, all the groups set up their stands, he couldn't get any attention. And this is before mitzvah tanks. So he had no what would I call it, business model of what to do. So he says what he did. He bought a big boom box and he started blasting Jewish music. And that's how he got people's attention. So that's one way to do it. You have to make noise to stick out. But the Rebbe is saying, no, it's much more than just sticking out, because the noise represents the passion of going beyond the self. And the noise represents we're battling the unholiness, which also is about self broadcasting. So we're going to take that element of negativity and we're going to transform it to holiness. So this is the story in short. A lot more to talk about and think about, but you have the link, so we can always go back and review. But this is a beautiful talk. So thank you for joining. Wonderful day, everybody.